All right, now we're done with the back stitching on both sides at a 1/4 inch, and we've knotted them both off so they're not going to come undone. And I got thinking about it while I was sewing this, and I thought about this little bag that we got in Peru. When we were in Peru at Machu Picchu, we were in Cusco, and we bought some jewelry because the people down there have a lot of silver in Peru, and they make a lot of beautiful silver jewelry. So we bought some silver jewelry, and this is a little bag that they gave us all our jewelry in, this little drawstring bag, and the whole thing is sewn by hand. And so I thought this is a good way for all of us to think about how many people have to sew because they don't have the opportunity to have a sewing machine. So here's our back stitching on both sides at a 1/4 inch. We're all done with that. Now we're going to flip it inside out. And hopefully you stitched it good enough that it's going to hold. And we're going to take our little seam gauge, and this is the point that helps push out the corners. So you're going to push out the corners. And we don't have to clip those corners because they're flat, so they open up really nicely. So that's the flap, and then we're going to push out the bottom corners. And now it's all pushed out. And when your thread matches, you should hardly see your stitches like that because mine's blue. It's showing up just a little bit, but that's okay. And then across here it should be stitched. Now this side is not stitched, so this is the last part of the button bag before we put the buttonhole and the button on it. And so we'll do that on a different video. So we're gonna make sure that corner's out really good because once you sew it up, it's gonna be all done. So we're gonna lay this flat and pin this down. And now we have nice finished edges all the way across it without any raw edges except for that little spot from here to here in the bag where we have an unfinished edge right there. And if you wanted to, you could do a buttonhole stitch over there. I'm not going to require you to do that because it's inside the bag. So we have a knot in our single thread. We're going to come up underneath here. I'm going to move that pin because I want to get underneath it. I usually go underneath that seam allowance and come up right in the corner underneath, and that hides the knot really well. And then I'm going to tuck that back in and put the pin back in. And now I'm just working on this side. This is the bag side. This is the flap side. So I'm just going to sew down the flap, and I'm going to tuck this seam allowance underneath so you can't see it. As you hand sew more and more, you'll be able to use your needle as a tool to tuck things in and work on them. So we're doing the same stitch we did on here where we take a small bite of the fabric, just a couple of little threads, 2 or 3 little threads, and take a stitch on the outside because it's going to show out here like the other one does. So you want it to be small. And then you're going to run your needle through the fold at about a 1/4, an 1/8 or a 1/4 inch. I like to do a 1/4 inch because then you get fewer stitches that show on the outside like this. Then you're going to take a little tiny stitch through a couple of stitches or a couple of threads, just tiny. I'm catching like 2 or 3 threads on my needle. Then I'm going back in right next to it to hide my threads. So there's 2 stitches right next to each other. And I'm running it about a 1/4 inch. And then you're going to take a bite again and run it through the fold. And then a little bite again. It's under the threads, so it's hard for you to see. I'll try to hold it back so you can see. Just a tiny little bite. Stitch. Ooh, sometimes it's hard to get it really small there. And then, and it does get caught on your needles, so as soon as, or your pins, so as soon as you feel like it's holding it down, get rid of that pin. And then another stitch. And you're going to do that all the way to the edge. And then we're going to tie it off. I was telling my husband, I also heard a story this week, since you guys made masks just a little bit ago, about a group of people in Africa who decided to make 100 masks for each family make 100 masks for their marketplace area where everybody goes to buy food because it's super crowded and it was really, susceptible to getting the virus. So I got everybody in all their families to sew, and they each made 100 handmade masks, and they sat around every night as a family and sewed those masks until they got 100 so they could outfit all the people that sold food in the market, the fruits and vegetables and things in the market could all have masks. And so honestly, that one mask that we made by hand, that was a lot of work. So for them to make 100 of those in a week or two with all members of their families working, that's pretty amazing. So we have to be grateful for sewing machines. There's a lot of people in this world that don't have the blessing or the opportunity to use a sewing machine and have to do everything by hand. So, all right, there we go. We're almost done with this. And then we're going to knot it off, and then your little bag's done except for the buttonhole. So the next video will be the buttonhole and how to sew the button on by hand. Then you're going to take pictures of it and send it to me for your grade. And you're all done with your sewing, and you're going to get a good grade on your sewing projects for this class. So here's the last one. I tucked that little seam allowance in with my needle so you don't see it. It just looks neater and tidier. So now I'm in the seam allowance, so I can stitch a little differently through the seam allowance because it's not going to show on the back. Okay, now we're down to that little tiny corner, and I've only got like 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to tie a knot right here and hide it up in the flap because the flap will hide the end of the knot. So I'm going to go under that last stitch and pull it tight and go through the loop, and then under the stitch again and through the loop and under the stitch the last time and through the loop. And then I'm going to take my thread up inside the flap, sandwiched in between this fabric and this fabric so there's no stitch on there, and pull it up and cut the thread. And now it's hidden the end in the fabric, and there's the back of my fabric. It just has a few little stitches that you can see. Then we have the pocket where we can put our jewelry or headphones, and then it flaps over. We're going to put a little buttonhole on here by hand, and then we're going to put a button on it, and you're all done. Good job.